don't think I need to tell anyone what the most common color in metal albums is, right? Now, there's metal albums in all sorts of colors, but usually black dominates. Then red and blue, purple and green, but nothing too bright. Orange or even yellow when we're a bit adventurous. White when we want to be artsy, but for this video I hunted down the rare and elusive pink metal album. One of the pinkest metal albums out there, and the album that sort of started this whole idea for me, is Sunbather, the second album by Deafheaven, and by many considered an absolute classic in the black gaze, post-black metal, hipster black metal genre, and by many considered one of the best albums of the 2010s. The album's orangey pink hue is meant to resemble the color you see in the inside of your eyelids when lying in the sun. Now, the real fun fact with this album art is this doesn't apparently work all that well if your skin is dark. And I found out about this when a darker skinned person on Reddit asked about how they didn't really see that color when they tried it. And yeah, it's because the pigment in their skin changes the color they see when they look at the sun with their eyes closed. Huh, interesting. Either way, Sunbather is a great album, and you should try it at least once, in my opinion. It also is by far not the only metal album with pink as a dominant color, and maybe you know, or maybe you've paid close attention to the thumbnail, there are a couple of well-known and well-liked classic metal albums that are maybe surprisingly mostly pink. Now, when it comes to metal, you can't get around Black Sabbath. And when it comes to Black Sabbath, you can't get around their second album, Paranoid. Rightfully considered an absolute staple for any heavy metal and hard rock fan, and one of the first metal albums ever. So yeah, you don't have to enjoy Black Sabbath, but you have to respect them. And you have to respect they put a guy in pink and yellow clothes on the album cover. The photography for this album art was in fact done with the song Warpigs in mind, which makes sense because the guy has a sword. But apparently the band wasn't allowed to use Warpigs for an album title, so they settled with Paranoid instead. This was also a song they wrote in 2 hours because they didn't have enough songs when they were recording the album, so they made Paranoid last minute in the studio while they were there recording the rest of the album. In case you hadn't heard that story yet, because it's quite well known. But yeah, it is pretty legendary. Speaking of legendary, one of the pioneering American death metal bands, Death, has album art full of these lovely pastel pink hues, except the album is titled Leprosy, the band's second ever and released in 1988, and the image is rather disturbing thanks to the artistic vision of graphic artist Ed Repka, who is known for making excellent and vibrant art for many metal bands and albums. Apparently, the man himself prefers punk rock over metal, and yeah, it's totally fine, it doesn't matter. You like what you like. Now, musically, Leprosy is not one to ignore if you're exploring the early days of death metal, and I honestly liked it more than Death's debut album Scream Bloody Gore, but it's just down to personal taste, really. Either way, Leprosy's album art proves that even pastel pinks can be metal as fuck, and can work perfectly for darker art. And another album that is kind of in the same vein, at least in terms of its cover art, is Nothing Face from 1989, the fifth studio album by Canadian thrash and progressive metal band Vovoid. It features this surreal sci-fi artwork that honestly is a bit unnerving to look at despite the softer pinks and peaceful sky blues of the art. Now, Vovoid has always been a unique band, and not just for their album covers. Musically, they stand out as well with their roots in thrash and speed metal, but never averse to experiment, and their album art reflects that perfectly. Right, for the next pink metal album, we stay in Canada, but we change genres and time period because this album has pretty classic metal, skull, bones, teeth, big black bird crow imagery, but also features an aggressive, almost neon sunset pink background. This is Angel Maker's self-titled second album from 2019, bringing very solid deathcore infused with black and thrash. This is one to give a spin if you're in that kind of mood, but also because that bright pink does perfectly represent the ferocity of this band's music. Do we need more convincing that really bright-ass colors absolutely have a place in metal? Now, while we're on the subject of painfully pink metal albums, the pinkest one I could find is titled Pink, evidently, released in 2005 and is the 9th studio album by a Japanese experimental band Boris. The album's sound can be described as doom metal and sludge and stoner, but also thrash, and because of the band's eclectic nature, you'll also find influences from punk and hardcore, noise, ambient, and shoegaze. I personally love it when a metal band gets a bit weird and crazy, so this is right up my alley. There is a much lighter pink alternative cover of this album that was released in 2006 for the United States, but the more simplistic design and bright asshole magenta pink of the original is definitely my favorite. Now, the second pinkest album I could find for this list is one that Boris's music may not have existed without, and it is Born Too Late by Saint Vitus, American doom metal band that formed in 1978 and one of the first doom bands to ever exist. Now, this album came out in 1986 at a time when thrash, speed, glam, and hair metal were all the rage, so the slow, drony, and depressing sound of the album was not met with a lot of enthusiasm when it came out. Today, it is considered an absolute classic in the genre, and this band is still considered one of the greatest influences for doom metal. And when you listen to Born Too Late, the bright pink cover art actually makes perfect sense with the 1970s nostalgia feel of the music and the themes of psychedelic drugs, war, insanity, and alcohol abuse. Compelling pink is what I would call this shade. Now, there's this other obnoxiously pink album I found, and it's appropriately titled Obnoxious. It's by British thrash metal band Acid Reign and came out in 1990. Now, British thrash was never as huge as the American scene, but Acid Reign is considered one of the so-called big four of British thrash of the 80s, along with Onslaught, Sabbath, and Centrix. Obnoxious is the band's second full album and the final one with the original lineup. And the band split up in 1991, though their vocalist did reform them again in 2015. The album was met with poor reviews, but honestly it's not terrible, though maybe trying a bit too hard to do something creative that doesn't always land, but the riffs are solid. I suppose it also came out at a time when thrash was sort of on the way out as the hugely popular metal genre and being replaced with death and groove metal and grindcore, and combined with a hot pink album cover, it probably never stood much of a chance anyway. But it fits in this list, so there you have it. Now, an album that has a similar pink-blue color scheme but came out way later and has very different energy is Hot Singles in Your Area by Scene Queen. And, well, these colors work well together because pink and blue are complementary colors, so basically your brain thinks the contrast is interesting to look at. Scene Queen is the alter ego of Hannah Rose Collins, and she gained fame through posting her music on TikTok, and she coined the term bimbocore to describe her music, a hyper-feminine offshoot of metalcore mixed with trap and pop influences. Hot Singles in Your Area is her first album released in 2024 and was generally met with positive reviews. I think it's funny and silly, but doesn't shy away from addressing societal issues and especially issues that women face. And the album art perfectly represents the bimbo idea until you listen to it and realize that Hannah is doing some really clever things with her project. So don't let the cover art fool you too much into thinking it's just dumb modern metalcore. And while we're on the subject of very obviously girly metal albums, there's Reborn Superstar by Japanese metalcore band Hanabiye. But again, don't let the bubbly anime cover art fool you. These four young women absolutely know how to kick ass and write fun but heavy songs that take you on a roller coaster ride with their unconventional take on metalcore mixed with EDM and pop elements. The album is only Hanabiye's second and came out in 2023. The cover artwork was done by digital illustrator Panko and depicts a young woman with pink hair and clothes and an astronaut helmet, and several songs on the album feature lyrics about outer space. This album is a personal favorite of mine, and I do really enjoy this modern era of metal where people can absolutely do really sparkly, funny, colorful things and still be appreciated for it, because to be fair, we're often a little bit too serious with our music, aren't we? And speaking of somewhat less serious metalcore bands, Electric Callboy probably takes the cake in terms of making really silly but awfully catchy songs, and they were already proving themselves way back in 2012 with their debut album Bury Me in Vegas. Not the most intricate cover art, but it's mostly pink, so it counts. As for the album itself, it's very third wave of electronic core, or crapcore if you will. It's chaotic and a bit unpolished, also because it's their first album, but this band always had such a knack for these earworm melodies that get stuck in your head for days. It is really fun if you can ignore the really stupid lyrics. Okay, we're gonna stay in the realm of metalcore for a little while longer, but let's get a bit more serious again. With Dayseeker's 6th studio album, Creature in the Black Night. That came out in 2025 and has this lovely purple, pink, salmon, orange gradient with a figure in a dark cloak in a field of flowers. I think it's just very pretty to look at. Dayseeker are described as a post-hardcore band that have major alt-rock, emo, and synthwave influences, and they weave these genres together expertly, if you're into that sort of music, as many of these sorts of bands border on radio rock with screamy breakdowns, so I know some people will argue it's not really metal, but personally I'm not super picky about this stuff, it really doesn't matter that much. But anyway, let's move back to more classic metal genres. I was pleasantly surprised to find a few pink black metal albums. And the first one I'd like to talk about is Kiss the Goat by Lord Belial, pioneers of Swedish black metal. Kiss the Goat is their debut album from 1995, and while the cover art and the band's logo are undeniably black metal, it's also undeniably pink. Now, my knowledge of the black metal scene of the 90s is mostly surface level, so I have no idea how fans who were around at the time responded to the color scheme of this album, but Lord Belial remains a respected name in the underground and are still active as a touring band who puts out new music quite regularly still. So from what I can tell, nobody really cares because, like I pointed out, the imagery is very much in line with classic satanic black metal stuff from that time. Musically, it's also very typical 90s black metal, but you won't find anything wrong with it either, so if you like old school 90s black metal, you will probably enjoy this one. The other pink black metal album I found is Ecstasies of Never-Ending Night by Devil Master, released in 2022, and this band, hailing from Philadelphia and formed in 2015, brings a mix of black metal and death rock, which works incredibly well, and they have been quite successful with it too. Ecstasies is their second full-length album, and the cover art depicts a dreamlike fantasy scene entirely in shades of this darker, dusty pink, and it's a color that does fit the vibes of the music excellently. It's also a good album if you want to find out what newer bands that are making waves in the black metal scene these days are up to. Because of the death rock and punk influences, it's like evil music you can dance to, if you wanted to try that. Okay, one black metal album that deserves an honorable mention here, although it's not a full-length album and the color was due to a misprint of the first edition of the record, is Mayhem's first EP, Death Crush, from 1987. This was an extremely influential EP for the further development of black metal, though musically it's still very thrash and of course very lo-fi and a bit sloppy, but that was just the vibe back then. The sleeve for the record was supposed to be red, but it came out hot pink at first. Now, the 1993 CD and LP were properly printed red, but the 1998 bootleg version was also pink. But you won't find an official pink version of this EP anywhere, unless you're lucky and can get your hands on one of the limited original copies from 1987. There were only about 1,000 made, so yeah, there's probably some out there, but you'll have to really look for it. But anyway, I just thought that was a fun little story. Even though a lot of the story of Mayhem themselves is really not fun. Yeah. Okay, let's stay in Scandinavia a little bit longer, but go to neighboring country Sweden, known for many an iconic metal band, and not the least of them is Katatonia. In the latter half of their career, more known for doing gothic and progressive metal, but in their early days they started out with death and doom, and particularly on their debut album Dance of December Souls. The album is dreary and sorrowful, and perfect for those dark winter days where you just want to sink away in some dark hole. And while the cover art is mostly pink, it still invokes all of those feelings with the shadowy faces and this distant light shining through the clouds. We've had aggressive pinks, unsettling pinks, compelling pinks, and cheerful pinks. Now we have a proper depressing pink. Now we're staying in Sweden to talk about absolute progressive metal legends Opeth and their very first studio album Orchid from 1995, with that striking album art to match. Opeth is by many considered one of the greatest metal bands of all time, and Orchid is where it all started, and where the band set the standard for the rest of their discography. With that unique blend of death metal vocals and instrumentation, melodic guitar harmonies, and acoustic passages. And Orchid would change the landscape of metal forever, even though Opeth didn't really see huge major critical acclaim for their work until they released Blackwater Park in 2001. But by this point, it's obvious they always have been an incredible band and extremely skilled musicians and songwriters. Well then, I started this list with a Black Gaze album, I might as well finish it with one, and here we have I Want to Be There by Sadness, a one-man Black Gaze project by Mexican musician Damien Ojeda. The project started in 2014 and has since produced a whopping 23 full albums, all released independently via Bandcamp. And I Want to Be There is one of the band's better known albums, and by many in the Black Gaze community considered an absolute must listen, and I agree with that sentiment. Now, the overall sound of this album leans a bit towards the energy of that other great Black Gaze band, Alcest, but certainly unique enough to stand on its own. On the cover, we have this dark figure with her arms spread out against this very pale pink background, and I think if you listen to the album, it's certainly a shade that matches the melancholic yet hopeful atmosphere. And there we are, that's a list of pink metal albums I've found. They're uncommon, but they have been around since the very beginning. And this was a fun video to make. Obviously, I didn't list every single pink metal album out there, so if there's albums you know about that I didn't list here, let me know in the comments. And let me know which of the albums I did talk about you did know about before. Right, that's gonna do it for me. I will see you in the next video. In the meantime, stay kind to each other and to yourself, and I will see you soon. Bye!